A
I
Hells
told you to
Angels
stay
biker
away!
humiliated a
Guys,
waitress and knocked her
please
to the
stop.
floor. Then a Navy SEAL and his canine walked in. Morning light brushed the checkered floor of Rosie's diner as Grace Miller moved quietly between the booths. The weight
Here
of
is
rolled
your coffee.
silverware tugged at her
Thank you.
apron.
Thanks.
Routine was the only thing keeping her steady. An old jukebox hummed, coffee cups clinked, and for a moment,
Here is your
everything
coffee.
felt normal.
Thank you.
"Morning, Grace," Sarah called. "You're early again." Grace smiled. "Mom had a good night," she said, choosing hope over fear, leaving the hospital bills unspoken.
Stay out of
What
this!
Grace didn't know was that this ordinary morning was
go.
about to test her dignity and reveal a
I see
quiet
the
miracle.
situation.
Before we begin, tell us where you were watching from. And if this story touches you, subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and unexpected grace. Morning sunlight slid gently over the mountain town, pale and forgiving, warming the cracked asphalt and the frostbitten pines that ring the valley like silent witnesses. Inside Rosie's diner, the day began the way it always did, slow, predictable, and heavy with things unsaid. Grace Miller moved between the booths with practiced care, her sneakers barely whispering against the black and white checkered floor. She was 28, tall but slightly stooped from years of leaning toward other people's needs, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a low ponytail that never quite stayed neat. A few loose strands framed her face, softening sharp cheekbones inherited from her mother. Grace's skin carried the faint pallor of someone who worked early mornings and worried late nights, and beneath her calm brown eyes lived a constant arithmetic of fear: rent minus tips, medicine minus hours, hope minus reality. Grace was good at her job, not loud good, not smile for tips good, but steady good. She noticed when a cup needed refilling before it was empty, remembered how old Mr. Daniels liked his eggs, and folded napkins with an almost reverent precision. That morning, her movements were quicker, tighter. Her mother, Evelyn Miller, 56 and once stubbornly strong, lay in a hospital bed 2 towns over, tethered to machines that beeped like impatient metronomes. Pneumonia, complications, tests that never seemed to end. Every clink of silverware Grace set down felt like another tick of the clock she was racing and losing. Behind the counter stood Sarah Whitman, the diner's manager, a woman in her early 50s with a wiry frame and shoulders hardened by years of responsibility. Sarah's blonde hair had gone gray not evenly, but in streaks, as if stress had painted it that way on purpose. She wore it in a practical bob and favored loose cardigans over her uniform, sleeves often pushed up as if she was perpetually ready to work or fight. Her face was angular, her mouth firm, but her eyes, sharp blue and endlessly observant, softened whenever they landed on Grace. Sarah had learned compassion the hard way, through a divorce that emptied her savings and a son who left town angry and never quite came back. She didn't hug easily, but she watched out for her people. "Coffee's fresh," Sarah said, nodding toward the pot, her voice brisk but warm. Grace managed a grateful smile, wrapping her fingers around a mug for just a second longer than necessary, letting the heat steady her shaking thoughts. The bell above the diner door rang. Grace looked up instinctively, her customer service smile sliding into place before her mind could catch up. The man who stepped inside filled the doorway in a way that felt deliberate. Troy Maddox was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neck thickened by muscle and old defiance. A graying beard framed his square jaw, trimmed but never neat, and his eyes, pale and restless, carried the casual confidence of someone accustomed to rooms making space for him. He wore a black leather vest over a long-sleeved shirt, patches stitched boldly across his back and chest, the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels catching the sunlight like a warning sign. Troy had learned early that fear could be a currency, and he spent it freely. Looped around his arm was Amber Lane, younger by at least a decade, slender and sharp-edged in both body and attitude. Her platinum blonde hair fell straight and glossy down her back, meticulously styled to look effortless. Amber's makeup was flawless, her lips permanently curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. She scanned the diner the way one might scan a thrift store, judging, dismissing, cataloging inadequacy. Amber had grown up scrambling for attention and learned that cruelty, when delivered prettily, often went unchecked. "Well," Amber said, her voice bright and cutting all at once, "this place hasn't changed." Troy laughed, a low sound that rolled through the diner louder than it needed to. A few patrons glanced up, then back down at their plates. Grace felt her shoulders tighten, a familiar instinct telling her to brace. She'd seen men like Troy before, not always bikers, not always loud, but always the same underneath. People who mistook service for submission. "Table for two?" Grace asked, keeping her tone even. Amber's gaze flicked over Grace from head to toe, lingering just long enough to be uncomfortable. "I guess," she said, "if the booths are clean." Grace led them to a corner booth, sunlight pooling across the vinyl seats. She wiped the table carefully, though it was already spotless, aware of Troy's eyes following her movements. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the hospital corridor, to her mother's labored breathing, to the stack of envelopes waiting on her kitchen counter. She told herself, just get through breakfast. Just survive the morning. As Troy slid into the booth, the leather of his vest creaking softly, he leaned back and stretched like a man claiming territory. Amber crossed her arms, tapping a manicured nail against the tabletop. Grace placed menus down, her fingers trembling despite her effort to keep them still. "Take your time," Grace said quietly. Troy smirked. "Oh, we will." As Grace stepped away, the weight in her chest grew heavier, an unspoken sense that something had shifted the moment the bell rang. Outside, the sun kept shining, indifferent and golden, while inside Rosie's diner, a different kind of weather was beginning to form, one that promised no rain, only impact. The morning moved on, but the air inside Rosie's diner had shifted, as if something sour had been stirred into the coffee. Grace felt it in her shoulders before she understood it in her mind. Troy Maddox and Amber Lane did not behave like customers settling in for breakfast. They behaved like an audience waiting for a show they intended to control. Grace returned to their booth with a pot of coffee, already bracing herself. Her polite smile stretched thin but intact, the way she had learned to wear it over the years, like a second apron. Amber reclined against the vinyl seat, long legs crossed, one boot tapping an impatient rhythm against the table base. In the morning light, her skin looked almost porcelain, flawless and cool, but her eyes were sharp and restless, constantly scanning for something to correct or condemn. "You took long enough," Amber said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. "Is it always this slow here, or is it just you?" Grace swallowed and poured the coffee carefully, the dark stream steady despite the slight tremor in her hand. "I'm sorry for the wait," she said, her voice even, trained. "Can I take your order?" Troy leaned forward, elbows on the table, his bulk making the booth seem smaller. Up close, the lines around his eyes looked deeper, carved there by years of squinting into wind and confrontation. His beard, flecked with gray, framed a grin that never softened. "We'll start with eggs," he said, tapping the menu with a thick finger. "Scrambled. Then maybe we'll see what else you can handle." Amber laughed softly, a sound that made Grace's stomach tighten. "Actually, no. I don't want scrambled anymore. I want an omelet. But not like last time. If it's too dry, I'll send it back." She tilted her head, studying Grace. "Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied, writing quickly, though her pulse thudded loud in her ears. As Grace turned to leave, Amber added, "Oh, and stand here a second." Grace paused. Amber pretended to deliberate, eyes flicking between menu options she had no intention of choosing. The seconds stretched. Grace could feel the heat rising in her face, the uncomfortable awareness of being made to wait on purpose. She thought of her mother's hospital room, of the way the nurse had spoken gently but firmly, of the word critical. She stayed where she was. Behind the counter, Sarah Whitman noticed. Sarah's sharp eyes missed very little. She paused mid-wipe, cloth clenched in her hand, her thin frame stiffening. Years of managing the diner had taught her the difference between impatience and malice. This was the latter. She considered stepping in, but she also knew the fragile economics of a small-town business, how one confrontation could ripple outward. Still, her jaw tightened, and she kept watching. "Never mind," Amber finally said, waving Grace away. "Go, before you forget everything." Grace moved back toward the kitchen, her chest tight, the familiar mix of anger and shame tangling together. She told herself to breathe, just plates and people. That was all this was. When she returned with the water glasses, Troy reached for his, then deliberately loosened his grip. The glass tipped, clattering against the table, water spilling across the surface and dripping onto the floor. Troy laughed, loud and unbothered. "Oops," he said. "Guess that one's on you." Grace dropped into one knee instantly, grabbing a towel from her apron, her cheeks burning. She wiped the floor, aware of Amber watching her with a smile that held no warmth. "Careful," Troy added, his tone mocking. "Wouldn't want you slipping too. That'd be a mess." Something inside Grace recoiled, not in fear, but in exhaustion. She had knelt like this before, for spills, for broken plates, for the small humiliations that service work made ordinary. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. She stood, smoothing her apron, and reached for the tray holding their plates, now ready at the pass. The eggs steamed faintly, the toast golden and precise. She balanced the tray carefully, the way she always did, and stepped toward the booth. As she leaned forward to set the plates down, Troy shifted suddenly. His hand caught the edge of the tray, not enough to knock it completely free, but enough. The movement was quick, almost casual, but the effect was immediate. The tray tilted. Grace stumbled, her foot catching on the corner of the booth. Her side struck the table hard, a sharp pain blooming along her ribs as plates slid and crashed to the floor. The diner went silent. Grace gasped, the sound pulled from her lungs by surprise and pain. She caught herself against the booth, heart hammering, eyes stinging. Ceramic shards lay scattered at her feet, yolk and toast smeared across the floor like something spoiled. Troy leaned back, raising his hands in mock innocence. "Whoa," he said. "You okay there?" His smile told a different story. Amber sighed dramatically. "Honestly," she said, looking down at the mess, "this is exactly what I mean. So clumsy." Grace straightened slowly, every movement aching. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, some wide with shock, some filled with sympathy, none quite daring to intervene. Her throat tightened, humiliation pressing against her ribs harder than the impact had. For a moment, she thought she might cry. Instead, she bent down, hands shaking, and began to pick up the broken pieces. Inside her, something cracked, quieter than the plates, but deeper. It was the realization that this wasn't just happening to her. It was happening in front of everyone, and everyone felt it. The joke Troy and Amber were playing had stopped being funny the instant it drew blood, even if no one could see it yet. The silence after the crash lingered too long, thick and unnatural, as if the diner itself were holding its breath. Outside the front windows, light snow had begun to fall, soft, deliberate flakes drifting down from a sky the color of steel. They dusted the parked cars, muted the road, and wrapped the small mountain town in a hush that felt almost ceremonial. The bell above the door rang again. This time, the sound cut through the stillness like a clean blade. The man who stepped inside did not rush. He paused just long enough for the warmth of the diner to meet the cold clinging to his clothes, long enough for his eyes to adjust, long enough for everyone in the room to feel him before they understood why. Ethan Cole carried himself with a posture that could not be taught in any civilian place. He was in his late 30s, tall without being bulky, his frame lean and efficient, built for endurance rather than display. His beard was short and neatly trimmed, dark with faint threads of gray at the jawline, and his face was all angles, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the muted green of deep water under cloud cover. Those eyes missed very little. He wore a NWU Type 3 AOR2 uniform jacket, the fabric worn but meticulously maintained, sleeves down, boots clean despite the snow outside. It wasn't the uniform that commanded attention, though. It was the stillness beneath it. Ethan had learned that stillness years ago, in places where noise meant death and hesitation meant loss. A roadside blast in Helmand Province had taken 2 men from his team, men he'd trained with, laughed with. Since then, Ethan moved through the world as if every moment deserved respect. At his side walked Rex. The German Shepherd was nearly 5 years old, sable-coated with a black saddle marking his back, broad-chested and powerful without heaviness. His ears stood alert, but his movements were calm, precise, the way only a working dog moves. Rex's amber-brown eyes swept the room with quiet intelligence, taking in shattered plates, the rigid posture of the man in leather, the woman on the floor collecting pieces of her dignity along with the ceramic. Rex had been trained in detection and protection, but more than that, he had been trained to read human distress, and he read it now, clearly. Ethan closed the door behind him, the bell settling into silence once more. He did not look at Troy Maddox immediately. Instead, his gaze went to Grace. He saw the way she held herself too carefully, one hand pressed subtly against her side. He saw the flush of humiliation on her face, the way her breathing was shallow, measured. He saw the broken plate fragments near her knee. Rex made a soft sound, barely audible, and sat beside Grace without being commanded. his body angled slightly toward her, a living barrier that asked no permission. His presence was grounding, warm, solid. Grace froze at first, startled, then slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Behind the counter, Sarah Whitman straightened. Her sharp blue eyes narrowed, then widened just a fraction. She recognized the look in Ethan's posture, the same look she'd seen once in her father years ago, when he came home from overseas and never quite sat with his back to a door again. Sarah's thin hands curled around the edge of the counter. Something had shifted. Troy noticed it too. He turned, irritation flickering across his face as his gaze traveled up Ethan's frame. Troy was used to being the biggest presence in a room, used to leather and patches making people flinch or move aside. He smirked, leaning back in the booth, one arm draped casually along the seat. "What's this?" Troy said, voice loud in the quiet diner. "You lost, soldier?" Ethan finally looked at him. The glance was brief, clinical, and then it moved away again, as if Troy had already been assessed and found wanting. Ethan stepped closer to Grace, not crowding her, just enough to make it clear he was there. "Ma'am," Ethan said to Grace, his voice low, steady, respectful. "Are you hurt?" The question broke something open inside her. Grace shook her head automatically, then hesitated. I don't think so," she said, though the ache in her ribs argued otherwise. "Just startled." Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and reassuring. Amber Lane rolled her eyes, her earlier confidence curdling into annoyance. "Oh, for God's sake," she said. She dropped the tray. "It happens." Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough for Amber to see his face fully. There was no anger in it, no raised voice, just attention. "That's not what I saw," he said. The words landed heavier than shouting would have. Around the diner, other customers shifted. A middle-aged mechanic at the counter, Frank Dillard, broad-shouldered with oil-stained hands and a permanently furrowed brow, cleared his throat. A retired schoolteacher near the window clasped her mug tighter. No one spoke yet, but the room had begun to lean in a different direction. Troy's smile thinned. "You accusing me of something?" Ethan glanced down at the broken plates, then back at Troy. "I'm saying no one deserves to be treated like that," he replied. Rex rose smoothly to his feet, standing now, not aggressive, simply present. The message was unmistakable. Grace felt it then, not fear, not relief, but something warmer and more dangerous, the feeling of not being alone. Outside, snow continued to fall, softening the world. Inside Rosie's diner, the tide had begun to turn. Ethan moved one step closer to the booth, not fast and not slow, the way a tide claims shore without asking permission. He placed his palm flat on the edge of the table, no slam, no threat. Yet the room seemed to lock around that simple gesture, as if the air itself had decided to pay attention. His hand was broad and steady, knuckles scarred faintly from years of work that didn't leave receipts, and his fingers rested inches from Troy Maddox's coffee cup, close enough to make the point without making a scene. "Apologize to her," Ethan said, his voice level, almost conversational. "Right now?" Troy's mouth twitched into the grin he wore when he wanted to remind people who he thought he was. He leaned back, leather creaking, angling his vest so the Hell's Angels patch caught the overhead light like a talisman. The grin carried a practiced contempt, the kind built over decades of being indulged. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he replied, eyes sliding to Ethan's uniform and back again. "This is between us and the waitress." The word waitress landed with intent, a deliberate reduction. Amber Lane lifted her phone, already framing the shot, her nails immaculate, her smile rehearsed for an audience she imagined would laugh with her later. She had always believed humiliation was power, if you recorded it first. Behind the counter, Sarah Whitman felt something snap, not loud, but decisive. She stepped forward, cardigan sleeves pushed up, her wiry frame squared. Years of swallowing compromises pressed against her ribs, memories of backing down when she shouldn't have, of teaching herself that survival meant silence. "Put the phone away," Sarah said sharply. "In my diner." Amber scoffed, but her hand hesitated. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging Sarah with a brief nod that said he saw her, then returned his attention to Troy. "You saw what happened," Ethan continued. "Everyone did." He glanced down at the shattered plates, the smear of yolk across the floor, then back to Grace. She stood very still, Rex's shoulder brushing her knee. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were clear now, fixed on the small space between Ethan's hand and the table. It was the space where choice lived. Rex shifted one step forward, not lunging, not barking, just enough to close that space. His body aligned with Ethan's leg, ears high, breathing calm. The message was unmistakable, a sentence without words. Troy's grin faltered. For the first time since he'd walked in, he looked around. The mechanic at the counter, Frank Dillard, heavy-jawed, grease still staining the creases of his hands, had stood. He wasn't tall, but he was rooted, feet wide, eyes steady. "That's enough," Frank said, voice gravelly. Near the window, an elderly woman, Mrs. Larkin, silver hair pinned neatly, cardigan buttoned wrong because her hands shook when she was upset, rose from her booth. "We've watched you two come in here before," she said softly, which somehow made it louder. "It's always the same." A young mother shifted her toddler onto her hip, the child's mittened hand gripping her sweater. "My kid's right here," she added. "This isn't okay." The room began to hum with agreement, not shouted, but layered. Chairs scraped back, throats cleared, eyes met. Amber felt it then, the sensation she hated most. Not being admired, not even being feared, but being seen clearly and judged uninteresting. She lowered the phone, lips tightening. "We're leaving," she muttered, tugging at Troy's sleeve. Troy straightened, pride warring with calculation. He looked at Ethan again, searching for heat, for something to push against, and found only stillness. "This isn't over," Troy said, though the words carried little weight now. "It is for today," Ethan replied. Sarah stepped aside, opening a clear path to the door, her posture saying she would remember this moment. Troy and Amber stood, chairs clattering too loudly in their haste. As they passed, Amber avoided Grace's eyes. Troy didn't. He tried to hold Ethan's gaze, and failed. The bell rang as they left, a thin, bright sound that cut through the diner like a verdict. Snow rushed in briefly, then the door closed, taking with it the last of their borrowed authority. The room exhaled. Grace felt her knees weaken as the delayed tremor of adrenaline made her lightheaded. Rex sat again beside her, close enough that his warmth steadied her balance. Ethan turned to her, the edge in his eyes easing. "You don't owe anyone silence," he said quietly. Grace swallowed and nodded. The words settled somewhere deep and permanent. Sarah crossed the floor and placed a hand at Grace's elbow, firm and grounding. "Take a minute," she said. "I've got the floor." Frank began gathering the broken pieces without being asked. Mrs. Larkin laid a napkin gently over the smear of yolk, like a benediction. Outside, snow continued to fall, softening the world. Inside Rosie's diner, justice had done what it does best when it remembers itself. It stood exactly where it needed to stand, and waited for the truth to catch up. The phone vibrated against Grace's palm as if it carried a pulse of its own. She stared at the screen for half a second too long, dread blooming before the words arrived, then answered with a breath that shook, despite her effort to steady it. The nurse's voice was calm, practiced, but the message cut straight through Grace's ribs. Her mother's condition had worsened, oxygen levels dropping, complications stacking one atop another like a cruel equation. Grace's fingers went numb. She thanked the nurse, ended the call, and stood there in Rosie's diner, with the snow still falling outside, and the echo of the bell lingering in the air, feeling suddenly smaller than the room that had just learned her name. My car," she said to no one in particular, the sentence breaking in the middle. The old sedan she relied on coughed more than it ran these days, and this morning it had refused to turn over at all. The hospital was 20 miles away, the road a ribbon of white already slick with ice. Pride rose first, reflexive and stubborn, the old habit of saying, "I'll manage." Fear followed immediately, heavier and louder. Ethan didn't offer reassurance. He didn't promise miracles. He simply reached for his coat, the movement decisive, economical. "We'll take mine," he said. "Rex comes with us." The certainty in his voice made room for breath. Outside, the cold bit clean and sharp. Ethan's vehicle, a dark, well-kept SUV bearing the quiet scars of long miles, idled steadily as snow gathered on the windshield. Grace climbed into the passenger seat, hands shaking, while Rex settled in the back, turning once before lying down, his presence a warm weight against the seat. As they pulled onto the road, the town fell away behind them, lights blurring into a soft, distant constellation. The drive was quiet, not awkward, just intentional. Ethan's hands were sure on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road with a vigilance honed in places where roads ended abruptly and decisions had to be immediate. Years earlier, a convoy had skidded on a night like this, and he had learned what ice could do to momentum, to plans, to people. He drove now with respect, not haste, as if speed itself were a temptation he refused. Grace pressed her palms together, then apart, counting breaths the way she had learned to do in waiting rooms. She spoke once, then stopped. Words felt flimsy beside the truth of fear. Rex lifted his head, amber eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. The dog's gaze was steady, neither pitying nor urgent, just present. It helped. At the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed with a brightness that felt unkind. The smell of disinfectant wrapped around them as Grace hurried to the desk. Giving her name, her voice barely more than a thread. A nurse led them down a corridor where footsteps echoed too loudly, where every door seemed to hold a story that might turn at any moment. Ethan followed without crowding, close enough to be useful, far enough to leave space. Rex lay down near the row of chairs outside the room, chin on his paws, eyes tracking Grace's movement as if memorizing it. Grace's mother, Evelyn Miller, looked smaller than Grace remembered, her skin pale against white sheets. Dark hair streaked with gray spread thin across the pillow. Tubes and monitors framed her like parentheses, the machines marking time with steady beeps. Grace took her hand, cool, fragile, and the tears she had been holding finally found their way out. She whispered things that didn't need answers. I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm not going anywhere. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. A physician, Dr. Alan Reeves, tall, soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a careful manner, explained options without false comfort. Aggressive treatment carried risk. Waiting carried its own. Grace listened, the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders like snow on branches. When she stepped back into the hall, her legs felt hollow. Ethan didn't tell her what to choose. He handed her a paper cup of coffee, strong and plain, and waited. Rex shifted closer, the warmth of his body anchoring the moment. Grace thought of the diner, of standing upright after years of folding inward. She thought of her mother's stubborn laugh, the way she'd always said, "Try, even if it scares you." Grace nodded to the doctor. "We try." The night thinned. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the numbers on the monitors steadied. The crisis didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. A nurse smiled with her eyes. "She's responding," she said softly. Grace's knees gave way, and this time she didn't catch herself alone. Ethan's hand found her elbow, firm and respectful, a human bracket around a moment that might have collapsed otherwise. When morning came, pale and tentative, Grace stepped outside to breathe. Snow still fell, lighter now, as if the sky were practicing restraint. She understood something she had spent years misunderstanding. Strength wasn't the absence of need. It was the courage to accept it without apology. Ethan, watching the snow with the same calm he had brought into the diner, felt a familiar truth resurface. Some battles are won not by force, but by choosing to stand and stay when leaving would be easier. They returned to Rosie's diner later that day. Sarah met them at the door, her sharp eyes softening as she took in Grace's face. "Coffee's on," she said simply. Frank raised a hand from the counter. Mrs. Larkin smiled like a blessing. Grace stood a little straighter, not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because she had learned where to place her feet. Outside, the road stretched on, no longer a maze but a line forward. Pride, once a wall, had become a bridge. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive like thunder from heaven. It comes quietly, through a stranger who chooses to stand, a hand that steadies you when pride finally lets go, a moment when fear loosens its grip just enough for hope to breathe. In this story, grace did not fall from the sky. It walked in, through courage, compassion, and a choice to do what was right when silence would have been easier. And perhaps that is how God works most often in our lives. Not always through miracles we can point to, but through people who listen, people who stay, people who become the answer to a prayer they never heard spoken. If you are watching this and carrying a quiet burden, a sick loved one, a broken dream, a moment when dignity felt shaken, remember this: you were never meant to carry it alone. God places help along the road. Sometimes it looks like strength. Sometimes it looks like kindness. Sometimes it looks like a second chance. And sometimes it looks like someone simply saying, "You don't owe anyone silence." May God bless you who are watching today. May He give you the courage to stand when it matters, the humility to accept help when it's offered, and the faith to believe that even in ordinary places, A diner, a hospital hallway, a winter road. His grace is still at work. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or what part of the story spoke to you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so more stories of courage, redemption, and quiet miracles can find their way to those who need them most. May God watch over you, protect you, and remind you, today and always, you are seen, you are valued, and you are never alone.